Sure, this is purely informal, so if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to interrupt me. It's totally fine. Like Dr. Price said, I think I'm going to start out and tell you all a little bit about Google and how we operate in public policy, because I always forget that it's interesting to people how we're structured, but I guess it's interesting. And then I'll go into a little bit about my work with the Transparency Report. So at Google, I'm on what's called the Central Policy Team. The Central Policy Team, which is a team that actually started out in March 2010. Prior to that, I worked in our Washington, D.C. office on our government relations and policy team there, which started, I think, back in 2005, that office. So what we have is basically a central hub where we do a lot of thinking. And our three main goals for the central team that I'm on is, one, try to look at policy issues and where they affect our business and where we want to be 5 or 10 years down the line, and start to strategize about how to get there. The second big thing we do is coordinate our teams. We don't really want somebody in DC saying something different on privacy than somebody in Germany, even though they might really want to. And then the third thing we do is work with product teams to figure out how we can create our products in a way that help foster policies that will benefit the open internet in the long run. So we do all those things. And then we work very, very closely with the government relations teams on the ground in DC and Brussels, London, Tokyo, and different capitals around the world to carry those things out. And in a lot of ways, I think people on the ground have much harder jobs because it's the day-to-day interaction with governments and figuring out the strategy around how we convince governments to do what we would like them to do, or do we think what's good for the open internet. And so that's how we're structured. My specific responsibilities, as Dr. Price said, I help run the day-to-day operations of our central team, as well as coordinating around the world. I also lead on policy development and strategy for crisis response, which is our disaster relief arm, where we work with a group of engineers to do more and more around technology and disaster relief. I also work on an issue called data liberation, which is about the ability to move your information in and out of Google services seamlessly and choose to go somewhere else if you want to. And then the third issue I work on, which is one of my favorites, is I help to project manage the Transparency Report, which is an interesting project because the background about the report is that it started out as a 20% project. And I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with what 20% projects are at Google, but basically, it was developed as a model to allow engineers the creative freedom and extra time to spend innovating and thinking about how to take our business to the next level or something that they're personally interested in. And so Gmail is actually a really good example of a 20% project that actually took off and scaled. But for every every 100 or so projects that are on that list, we have a list that goes around to the engineers to see who wants to volunteer. Very few of them ever take off or get off that list. And the Transparency Report was interesting because it was very unique. And I think it became very popular very quickly among engineers with their volunteer time. And it was mostly, I think, because it combined that Silicon Valley ethos of looking at the data first to solve big problems, right? So when they see issues of overbroad government censorship or surveillance, as an engineer or something, you're thinking, well, what can I do to solve it? What can I do to tangibly help the situation? And the Transparency Report was a way of generating and surfacing that data to do just that. So I think that's where it originally started. Sorry? 20% project still exists, although our team has now gone full-time. Let me see. This didn't really work out. So with that, I think I'm going to start out, and again, feel free to interrupt, start out with talking about why we put together the Transparency Report. One of the things that we really think is important at Google is the ability to measure things. Like I said, data is very important. So the Transparency Report is one of the ways that we thought about how can we measure freedom? How can we measure freedom in order to better preserve it when it comes to how governments are able to control either how users access information or how they're able to lawfully intercept information. And what can we show to users to help them decide, is this government actually creating policies and laws that are in my interests? Are the effects of laws around copyright, defamation, and privacy actually doing what we're hoping it will do? Because the internet's such a new medium, right? We don't how laws affect it have yet to be seen. And so when we developed the transparency report, what we looked at, the first thing we thought of was, well, we should start surfacing government requests, right? And start looking at how many requests we receive from governments to either, one, remove information, so that's content removal requests, or two, requests for user data. And these were the two big categories we discovered. I want to clarify that this is like a very iterative project for us. Something that at Google that's very important to us is instead of waiting for the perfect product, we like to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll launch something and then we'll iterate it many times. You might have seen this. A lot of products we say are in beta, which means we're still trying to develop them. And even something like search is a project that we're consistently trying to improve, which is probably one of our core projects. So coming up with the right set of measurements for government requests wasn't an easy task. You would think that a company like ours that's so interested in organizing information and making it universally accessible would have a really intelligent and wonderful way to track the requests, but we didn't. So what ended up happening is we basically had to manually email around to all of our legal and policy teams around the world and get them to all start tracking government requests for content removal or for user data in the same way for the first time around. And moreover, there were a lot of political concerns to consider. So we were asking ourselves questions like, one, is it worth the time and effort to actually do this by hand because it's quite manual? Two, what if it jeopardizes our business or with governments where we do business? So, for example, are we, by exposing this information that's never been kind of public before, are we going to make them angry? And to that extent, will disclosing the numbers like this put our employees on the ground at risk? Will the numbers be misinterpreted, as they sometimes are, as data, always at risk of? And finally, but most importantly, is it actually going to make a difference if we disclose this information? So a year and a half later, I can tell you that I believe the answer to that last question, does it make a difference, is actually yes. Many of you might know that there's this law, there's an amendment going around in India that would actually force companies like Google to, one, monitor users, and two, force them to adopt government-mandated terms of service before they can use any of our products. And so similar requirements in other countries have actually forced companies to really censor quite broadly to fulfill these kinds of requirements because they're afraid that the government's going to come after them, or there's going to be a lot of private lawsuits around the information that's on their services, which overall chills speech. But as the amendment was being debated last September, I think, something really interesting came up, which is this very young Indian MP from an opposition party stood up and said that the data in the transparency report at the time, which I can show you, quite interesting, indicated that the government was making a lot of frivolous requests that were promoting the government point of view instead of promoting freedom of expression. And he specifically said that these new rules curb freedom of speech and violate the spirit of the IT Act, which removed liability from companies like ours for the content that's presented on our services. So the numbers he was citing was from here, where we only complied with 22% of the removal requests that came to us. And sure. So what that means is when we receive a request, we usually evaluate it with some standards, and then obviously we treat each case individually because they're all different. So the different things we evaluate it by are, one, is it a written request? Is it just a phone call? We prefer for it to be written. The second thing we evaluated is, does it cite an appropriate law, or is this someone just asking me to remove content? Is it just a politician calling me up because he's unhappy and wants me to remove something? The third question that we ask is, is it coming from the appropriate government agency? Is it signed by a judge? Is it a court order? Is it coming from a government agency that has a jurisdiction to ask us for this information? And lastly, is it sufficiently narrow? So for example, if somebody asks us to remove all videos that have to do with a certain religion from YouTube, that's not a specific request, so we're going to push back and we're going to deny that unless they come back to us with something specific. Usually with videos, we ask them for specific URLs. So you have to be and then we will go and check every single one of those URLs to make sure it actually has to do with the request that they're citing. So we do a lot of due diligence with regards to legal removals because we have a strong bias in favor of increasing and maximizing access to information on our services. It's something that we're very committed to. And so he was citing these numbers and basically was pushing back on the amendment. We've also seen in cases in Brazil where they've looked to, let's see if I can get the, sorry, yep. Sure. Right. So we started doing these product and reason breakdowns for the first time last year. The first launch of this didn't have these breakdowns, and then, like I said, it's an iterative process, and people thought this information was important. They wanted to know why, governments were asking, so we started to do these breakdowns. I actually think the reason breakdown is far more interesting than the product, but reflects each other. And in some cases, there's government criticism, and what we do is we annotate those requests. So if you look here, it says, we removed a blog and YouTube videos. Oh, we have requests to remove that were critical of chief ministers and senior officials, and we didn't comply with those requests. In a lot of those cases, I'm guessing they were not court orders. They were not court orders. So what that means is in these 4 requests, we got either written or verbal requests to remove information, but didn't cite any laws, so they were not illegal. And so we're just getting pressure from the government to remove this information. In Brazil, another interesting case, they have very broad definitions of defamation. So if I said that you were online, publicly, that you're a lying, untrustworthy crook, and you are, it's still considered defamation. And so they can actually issue us court orders to remove that kind of information. So what you see is a high number of requests related to defamation, actually, from Brazil. And what happens in these cases is we do comply with local laws in countries where we operate, right? But what we do is we may or may not, if it's a specific request, we'll remove it from the Brazil domain, but we'll leave the content up on google.com because we believe google.com, where we argue that it's governed by U.S. law only, and this isn't illegal in U.S. law. So the breakdown is quite fascinating. The high numbers also relate to the fact that we have a social network that's very popular only in Brazil and India for some reason. It's called Orkut. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it. But in places where we have larger market share, or we have certain products that are more popular, that can bump up the numbers as well. So the important thing to remember is that the numbers aren't necessarily reflective of more or less censorship. What it's reflective of is that specific laws and their effects in the given country. The other thing that's interesting about Brazil is an electoral law. This electoral law says that during elections, nobody can upload any sort of parodies or criticisms of candidates on the internet for a given time period. And so what you'll see, John Stewart doesn't do well done. So what you'll see is these court orders that we get from electoral courts that are specific to Brazil because of these requests. And what we'll have to do is, because it's a court order and we have to abide by local law, remove that information from the Brazil domain, but we leave it up again on google.com and youtube.com.
Go into a little bit more detail about what, if any, laws govern jurisdiction with top-level domains. So whether the difference between if it's on .com or .br and who has jurisdiction in different ways.
So I think it's interesting that you asked that. It's a question that's up for debate still. Internet regulation and who has jurisdiction over what is still very much contentious. I mean, some companies and governments say that if you have users in our country, that means we have jurisdiction. In our interpretation of it, we say that for the local domains, we abide by the local laws for that country. For YouTube and for .com, we abide by U.S. law only. That's something that's definitely still being debated, and we actually have quite some difficulty sometimes pushing back on governments because they do believe that they're saying, you have users in my country, then you're subject to my local laws on youtube.com and google.com as well. We had this issue in Turkey where there were videos on YouTube that were basically defaming Ataturk or criticizing him. And what ended up happening was the Turkish government came to us and said, well, these are illegal in our country, so you have to restrict them. And so we said, okay, well, we'll abide by our local laws, and because we consider, and we will restrict these videos for Turkish users only, so Turkish IP addresses. But then they came back to us again and said, no, actually, you should restrict it for the entire world because there are Turkish citizens around the world. And we said, well, no, we're not going to do that. And then they blocked us. So it was really interesting to see like the interplay between companies and governments and what actually happens there. So they blocked us for about 2-3 years, YouTube.com for about 2-3 years. And then it was interesting, the president came out last year and said, I don't believe that YouTube should be blocked. I don't know enough specifics about how the Turkish government operates, but apparently the president can disagree with decisions that judges make and that sort of thing. And then I think late last year, they lifted the block. So it's been kind of interesting to see how that plays out. But it's really fascinating because it's almost like the company has a diplomatic arm, sort of, or some sort of weight to throw around. I will say the other interesting thing is that in government requests is that you can see a high number of requests that are actually very much don't have to do with censorship at all. So in the UK, in the second half of 2010, because these are biannual reporting periods, you see this huge number of requests, so 93,518 items requested to be removed, which all had to do with fraudulent advertising. So they do make requests of us that are actually, obviously couched in very laws that have nothing to do with free speech whatsoever.
Recent law about photo retouching or like the...
No. This is second half of 2010. So it's related to, it was basically, I think it was, this case was somebody pretending to be a government agency and putting up a bunch of ads on AdWords to direct them to like the wrong site. So, but you do see effects of those kinds of laws as well. So we're seeing that more and more. And so I think the difficult thing about this particular feature is that there are so many nuances that we haven't been able to explain quite yet. But if people like you delve into it and learn about the local context, you're better able to interpret that. We're still trying to overcome that sort of interpretation barrier without seeming too biased.
Yeah, you mentioned in class, some of the students from China said there are few requests from China.
Yes.
And so
that's a good point.
It's interpreted the wrong way in China or something like that.
Right. So one of the challenges that was mentioned in the class that I was in earlier was, like Dr. Price was saying, you can see this. We have so few requests from China. Why is that the case? In countries where they know they kind of can't get what they want from us, what ends up happening is that they just block our services instead. Like, why go through the route of having to go through the trouble of getting a court order if you know that we might deny it? So instead they just use their Great Firewall and block a lot of our content and a lot of our services, or make it difficult to access that material. But in some cases, they still do make requests of us.
But the interpretive question was...
Right, sorry.
So people say...
So people, I think they were telling me that in media reports in China, they were saying, oh, we're really transparent and we're great, and that's why there's so few requests. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, if you know the history of our relationship with the Chinese government, you would know that that's not exactly the case. So, and I can go into that if you all would like a little later as well.
The impression I'm getting, and I guess my question is this correct, is that a lot of it is really diplomatic. You get a request, even if it's in writing, and you talk to them, okay, not specific enough, maybe they come back with something more specific and you work with them. It doesn't sound like very often Google is going into the courts to push back against a court order or some more formalized process.
We do push back in court orders quite a bit. And there's a U.S. case in 2006, and I haven't really talked that much about user data requests yet, which we can't find a country. But basically, the U.S. government asked us for over 2 months' worth of search data on different users in a criminal case, and we said that the inquiry was too broad, and we actually pushed back and won a court case against them. And so we narrowed the set of data that we had to release to something that was much more tailored to that specific case rather than the amount they were requesting. So we do push back on court orders quite often if it's not specific enough.
Still, do you enter into the courts, the electoral courts, or do you just interpret them wholesale?
So we require them to list the URLs of what they want us to. They can't just say remove all videos related to the X candidate. They have to actually list them down for us. And if if they do say remove all videos related to X candidate, we will push back on them and say you have to make them specific. Yes?
Is there any easy way to sort of norm these by the amount of traffic? I mean, do you have sort of comparable lists about how much traffic there is for each country?
So that's exactly what I'm going to get into next.
Okay. And then another question also, can you tell us a little bit about sort of who's making these decisions?
Sure.
Are they local in the country? Are they centralized? I mean,
so we have local, yeah, absolutely. So we have local, obviously local offices in a lot of these countries where we have like a local legal team and a policy team that receives these requests from the governments because it's their job to interact with them. They actually transfer them all to our Mountain View team that handles all legal removals. And the reason we have them mostly in Mountain View is to make sure that they're consistent and they're trained to basically go through these requests the same way. So yeah, so it's actually a central team housed in Mountain View on the legal side that handles all of these requests. Yes?
I'm wondering, I mean, this is really interesting. Have you thought of doing a similar thing with takedown requests for commercial companies? So a copyright holder supposedly comes and says, take something down, which is a lot. Is there any list I could go to find out what firms are doing that?
Right now we have, we disclose all of the copyright removals we do on chilling effects. Chilling effects, which is a centralized database that's run, I think, by the Berkman Center, where we disclose all of the entirety of the court order and the request and what we did. Not yet. Something we're thinking about. So this is basically our government request tool, and then beyond that, we have our traffic tool. And the way our traffic tool came together was quite different. It presented many more technical challenges. Government requests, you can kind of count them one by one, and it's fairly easy to measure. When it comes to traffic, though, there are a lot of other considerations, right? One, we can't release raw traffic numbers because that's a trade secret, that's a business issue. Two, what about user data in countries where we don't have that many users for a country? You know, that's a privacy issue. And three, what about denial of service attacks that will throw off patterns of traffic if you try to normalize it in a certain way? Is it not loading? This is working. Yeah, we're having a little bit of trouble. It's okay. It's okay. I can turn it on and off and see what happens. So it took us, and I can give you more background, but it took us about a year to figure out how to navigate all these challenges. There we go. It took us about a year to navigate all these challenges with engineers actually working on nights and weekends. So it's really out of the passion for the issue. And finally launched the traffic feature in late 2010. The interesting thing that I was telling Dr. Price earlier that I didn't mention in the class was that we had originally envisioned this as an internal tool. And the reason is because I was working on free expression in DC at that time. And I was telling them, well, wouldn't it be nice to know where we're being blocked around the world rather than receive like a press inquiry about it? We were literally hearing about it from on the ground before we knew about it internally, which is never a great position to be in because you're definitely reactive and there's no way for you to engage in the same way as if we knew about it ahead of time. But then we realized that quickly that it's really useful for external people who are really interested in these issues. And in particular, when we launched it in late 2010, we launched it with a delay because they wanted to be able to make sure the traffic was accurate and that sort of thing. And then very quickly we realized how useful it actually was when the Egyptian government decided to cut off access to the internet in early January. And what you see is a very dramatic drop. What the traffic graphs show is a day-to-day pattern, right? So users come online, they start to use our services, and they go to sleep, and then over and over again. And what we look for is anomalies in the patterns because the traffic is normalized. So in this case, you can see the 5-day drop. And we started to see news outlets citing us as like a source of, oh, this information is inaccessible in a given country. And so you actually see in recent months a lot of patterns having to do with the Arab Spring. We annotate every time we find an anomaly. It's sometimes hard to find them because we don't have the bandwidth to go through every single country product combination. So we actually work with a lot of academics to help us out and think tanks to help us out with analysis of these trends. But you'll see a lot of the services going on and off corresponding with the Arab Spring. You can also see, things like if Blogger was accessible in the UK yesterday or today, and it's actually on just a few minutes delay at this point, so it's functioning in real time. And like I said, this project actually became so important to us that we now have a full-time team working on it, and to surface these types of data sets and also others that we think could contribute to public policy issues. But there are a lot of drawbacks to this product, and like I said, it's an iterative process, so there's a lot that we're still trying to work through. The first is that it only detects these big breaks in patterns, right? So we can't detect things like in China or Saudi Arabia with a keyword filter. You can't see that in this tool. We also can't see anything like redirects. So if a country in 2002, when China redirected google.com to baidu.com, we couldn't see that in this kind of graph. We also can't see anything about surveillance. And this is a really interesting case where we looked at this graph in February and we saw that YouTube was accessible in Syria. And we all thought this was like a great thing, right? Generally, we were like, oh, great, service is back up. But what the Syrian government was actually doing, which was hypothesized by people at EFF and some other organizations, is that they were listening in on our users. So they were turning these services like YouTube and Facebook back on so that they could actually be listening in and intercept a lot of their information and find these activists. And so what that told us was that there's a bigger problem that we don't really know how to measure yet, and that's one of surveillance. How much more do users post or less do users post if they know that their government is listening in on them? That's something that's really hard to measure. That's something about freedom that's going to be really hard to quantify in the future. I'm not sure why this is not moving. Oh. And so the other big, I think, the other big challenge that's beyond just a technical challenge is that our data sets are so limited, right? They're only limited to what we see online. Governments can be making many, many requests of other companies, and specifically like telecommunications companies, Facebooks, and otherwise. Like maybe it's the case that we only see 2 or 3 requests from a government, but an ISP can see 50 requests from that government in a given time period. We don't know, and so the data set is very subjective and incomplete. And so we've been talking to a lot of other companies, talking to governments about being more transparent and doing similar reports and doing them in a similar format so that we're not comparing apples to oranges when they actually decide to disclose this information, and to hopefully make it a lot more interesting. Let me see if we can fix this again. The last thing I would like to say is that traffic can also be interesting, fascinating with some funny events. A while ago, there was an old woman who was scavenging for metal in, I think, Armenia. And so she was scavenging for it and then decided, oh, I'm going to pick up this piece of metal, I'm going to cut it off and bring it back home. And what ended up happening was she cut off internet access to neighboring country of Georgia for half a day as a result. And that actually, here's Syria when they turn YouTube back on. And that actually shows up in our report. And we found that to be quite funny. March 28th of this last year. But these things are all indicative of certain things about internet policy, right? It's like a very small drop that you can see. What does it actually mean when you build your network so that there is a single point of control and therefore a single point of failure, right? So these types of, you're more susceptible to these kinds of outages. But the government did it in the first place because they wanted more centralized control of information access to the country, right? So it's a lot of these things that we're starting to see and figure out. We're working hopefully with a lot more companies and academics like you all, or think tanks, to figure out these trends and patterns. So with that, I think I'll open it up for more questions. Oh.
I know that you like the FAQ and said nobody reads the FAQ, so
yes.
FAQs could be your first form of questioning from the audience.
They could be, but they can also read it themselves. So it's up to you guys. I mean, I can go through the FAQs or we can just chat. Oops, sure. Yep.